Forced to work from home by your employer? Laid off or feeling depressed at home? Do you want to make money working from anywhere? We'll show you how to do it from your couch. It's time for another episode of the Work From Home Show. Coming to you from their homes in Austin, Texas and Tampa, Florida, here are your hosts, Adam and Naresh.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Work From Home Show. Shout out to all our homies, homeboys, homegirls, home trans, all the work from homers out there. I'm Naresh. Today we have Dr. Patrick Moore on the show. He is the co-founder and former president of Greenpeace Canada, also the #1 best-selling author of Confessions of a Greenpeace Dropout, The Making of a Sensible Environmentalist, and the new book, Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom. Dr. Patrick Moore, thank you so much for joining us on the Work From Home Show.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Naresh.
So before we get started into climate change, how it ties into work from home, I want to learn a little bit more about your background. I obviously shared a very quick synopsis of your resume earlier, but tell us, what are your credentials? What is your experience working with the environment?
Well, Naresh, I grew up in the wilderness of northern Vancouver Island on a floating village with no road to it, and I went to school by boat till I was 14 years old, and was then sent off to boarding school in Vancouver, where I learned city ways and excelled in science, especially life science. I hadn't realized that my upbringing in the forest and on the tide flats and in nature had given me such a love for the environment. And I went on to the University of BC to do a honors degree in biology and forestry, and then a PhD in ecology. While I was doing my PhD in ecology, I heard about this little group. This was the height of the Cold War, the Vietnam War, and the threat of all-out nuclear war between the United States and Russia. And I joined this group, and we sailed a boat, a small 85-foot halibut fishing boat, across the North Pacific Ocean from Vancouver to the Aleutian Islands, got on Walter Cronkite's news for protesting the 5-megaton hydrogen bomb test that the United States was conducting in Alaska. And the rest is history. We won. Not long afterwards, President Nixon canceled the remaining H-bomb tests, and that was the last hydrogen bomb the United States ever detonated. And it's sad to see that we're back at a place now that may not be quite as threatening as it was then, but there's a sorry situation going on the other side of the world, and I sure hope it gets over with as soon as possible.
I want to talk a little bit about science and logic, because don't even assume I'm a dummy when it comes to the environment, the climate stuff. I just don't follow it because it's not important in my life. I know a lot of people are going to get offended if I say that, but I don't wake up every morning thinking, how am I going to reduce carbon emissions today? Now, I will say that based on some very basic research that I've read, I think I'm more an environmentalist than most of the world, because I'm vegan, and that's by choice. I'm a converted vegan because of health reasons. And also I own a teak timber farm in South America. So I basically, plant trees and own this parcel. But with that being said, I do these for my own reasons that have nothing to do with the environment. So tell us what is this environmental movement? Is there any science and logic behind it, or is it just emotion and sensationalism?
Well, it certainly has gone sideways in the last few decades. I started out in 1971 as an environmental activist, leading Greenpeace campaigns around the world for 15 years. But by 1985, I realized that we were being hijacked by the political left using the environment as a fundraising tool and as basically a propaganda tool. And I had to leave because suddenly I found my fellow directors, none of whom had any formal science education besides myself, were saying that humans are the enemies of the earth, the enemies of nature, as if we are the only bad species. That's way too much like original sin for me. And I don't believe that. Most people are good. And the other thing that they decided to do, which was really the clincher, was they decided to have a campaign to ban chlorine worldwide. They nicknamed chlorine the devil's element, and then they nicknamed polyvinyl chloride, which is vinyl or PVC, which is a ubiquitous material in our society and a very important one. They called it the poison plastic, when in fact it isn't poisonous at all. It's completely non-poisonous. That's why we wrap our food in it and put our food in containers made of plastic of various types in order to prevent it from being contaminated. So I had to leave in 1985, and since then I have fashioned myself a sensible environmentalist, basing my positions on science and logic rather than fear, sensationalism, and basically false narratives. And one of the most false narratives is that carbon dioxide is dangerous. Carbon dioxide is the food for all life on this earth. And the fact that we are putting some of it back in the atmosphere, where it came from in the first place, you have to remember the fossil fuels were all made from life. And when we burn them, we are returning carbon dioxide to the atmosphere that was locked up in these deposits over the millennia. And in fact, CO2 on average has constantly declined in the global atmosphere from when it was 6 to 10,000 parts per million down to as low as 180 during the most recent glacial advance, which was 20,000 years ago, during this Pleistocene ice age that we are in. I mean, the great irony is we are in one of the coldest periods in Earth's history now. Even though we're in an interglacial period, it's still colder than it was for the previous 250,000 years from today. The previous ice age was called the Karoo. This one's called the Pleistocene, and we're still in it. And there's no telling when it will end. The last one lasted 100 million years. This one is only 2.6 million years old and shows no sign of ending. So that's one irony. The other irony is that CO2 is lower at this time in history than it has been for all of the history of the Earth. We have raised it back up to 425 parts per million, when all through history, except for the most recent period, it has been much higher than that, and life has flourished. There was hundreds of millions of years when the poles had no ice on them, and there were far more species there then. Just look at Antarctica. Penguins. Can you think of anything else? And if it wasn't for the sea having a lot of food in it around the ice, there wouldn't be any penguins there either. So it's very obvious that the most biodiverse ecosystems are in the warmest parts of the Earth, except where it's too dry, the deserts. But most people don't realize that 5,000 years ago, the Sahara Desert was green, and there were towns all across it, and people herding their animals out there because there was lots of food to eat. And then it dried up. As the Earth began to cool, we're actually in what is now about a 5,000 year slight cooling period. The Little Ice Age, which peaked in 1700, was the coldest it's been since we came out of the recent glaciation. It was nowhere near as cold as that, because during the most recent glaciation, 20,000 years ago, there was a mile of ice over the whole of Canada and down into the U.S. northern tier states. That was way too cold. But to think that this is too warm is absolutely crazy if you look at the history of the Earth.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head at the beginning of your answer when you said that what I think an easier way to put it is this seems like a marketing strategy to raise funds. And you see the left, they're very, very good at this. Maybe there are examples of the right doing this too. I'm just not as familiar. But you see initiatives like this, like Black Lives Matter, which you look at the founders of Black Lives Matter and the big houses that they're buying and the amount of money, billions and billions of dollars, has been funneled to the Democratic Party, the DNC. It seems like climate change is similar, especially when you lay out facts like this. It's fear-mongering. I remember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez a while ago when she was just elected to Congress, said that the world will end in about a decade. By 2030, the world will end. And here we are, not too far from 2030. And, can the world end because of nuclear war? Maybe, but I don't think climate change is a reason for the world to end. It doesn't look like that's going to happen anytime soon. But people really feed into that fear mongering, and they do donate money. And so are you telling me that this is just a big marketing? That's what I'm a marketer myself. I've done many episodes on my digital marketing background. Do you think this is just one big marketing ploy to raise funds?
That's right. There's no doubt about it. Otherwise, they would recognize that this is a very cold period in Earth's history and that CO2 is very low and is also the main food for all life on Earth. All life is carbon-based, and all the carbon in our life comes from CO2, from the atmosphere or from the sea. Carbon dioxide is also dissolved in the ocean, where it is nearly 50 times as much CO2 in the ocean as there is in the atmosphere. And the reason CO2 goes up and down during the various ice ages, as some people call them, but they're really the glacial periods, is because when the ocean cools, it absorbs gases from the atmosphere. So it's the temperature changing that causes the CO2 to change, not the other way around. We have actually no solid evidence that shows that carbon dioxide is the cause of warming of the atmosphere. Actually, through most of the history of the Earth, they've been going in the opposite direction. And for 100 million years, they went in the opposite direction way back when. But today, yes, CO2 and temperature are both rising. But that doesn't mean one causes the other. It's a very simple thing to explain the difference between a cause-effect relationship and a correlation. Shark attacks and ice cream consumption are highly correlated. When shark attacks go up, ice cream consumption goes up. And when they go down together. That's because they are both caused by a third common factor, which is temperature. In the summer, people go to the beach, have an ice cream, and then go swimming, and some of them get attacked by a shark. In the winter, they don't do either. So there's a great website called Spurious Correlations, in which it shows some of the craziest pairs of things are highly correlated with each other when it's obvious they have nothing to do with each other. But there are way more correlations than there are cause relationships. Cause-effect relationships are special. It means that one thing is causing the other. And when the oceans warm, it does cause CO2 to come out and increase the atmospheric level. We see this happening just during the most recent glaciation. CO2 fell to 180 ppm. The other thing we know is that CO2 lags the temperature by about 800 years, which is probably due to the ocean currents and how long it takes for the cycle to complete itself as the ocean warms. There's no way that the cause comes after the effect. And Al Gore knew that when he published An Inconvenient Truth, his video where he was showing CO2 and temperature being linked to each other. But the linkage is that when the temperature increases, probably due to solar activity, then that's why the CO2 goes up and down. It's not the other way around. And that is well known among the scientific community. It's just that the bureaucrats, with their politicians telling them to give the scientists in the universities money to do this false narrative that CO2 is the cause of just about everything bad in the world. That is what they are basing their fundraising on. And they are raising more money than the fossil fuel industry is giving to its own associations, like way more. The amount of money going into this scare campaign is phenomenal. And of course, it's not just the climate issue. It's many other issues, such as they say that 1 million species are going to go extinct in the next 30 years or whatever. That's just a lie. We have actually done a very good job of preventing further species extinction. Humans didn't care about species going extinct until about 100 years ago. The passenger pigeon's extinction in North America really sort of started the movement to make sure species don't go extinct. And a lot of people around the world work on that every day and try to get species back into the wild that have become extinct in the wild. Many of the world's zoos are involved in this work. And, you know, we are not an evil species. In general, we are good. There are evil ones among us, and they're the ones burning down the cities. But most people are good. And it's just outrageous that people would burn down businesses of innocent people, restaurants and stores and looting and all this stuff that's been going on. Those are the bad people. And there's no question of that in my mind.
Yeah, and those people, they did it to their own communities. It's not like they went to the communities that they hate and did it there. They did it to their own. But anyway, that's a completely different side topic. So I want to share what I think are 3 or 4. Tell me where I'm wrong. But I want to share 3 or 4 different ways that we could improve the environment, or as the left says, curb climate change. And the first thing I mentioned earlier is by going vegan or just vegetarian. I read that a majority of the pollution that is caused is because of the meat industry globally, worldwide. And I'll say these reasons first, or I'll list these first, and then I'll let you respond. So that's number one. And of course, the left doesn't follow the science, at least what's published, and they eat a lot of meat. Let's put it that way. They want free healthcare, and they don't take good care of their bodies in general. Of course, there are many people who do. You have the naturalist leftists, the ones who don't take the vaccines, who are vegan and all that, and that's fine, but that's a very small minority. So that's number one. Number two is, again, according to what I've seen, the United States, they make it seem like the United States is a bad guy, when in reality, it's the third world countries, the emerging countries that are polluting way more and don't have any regulation on the environment. And the reason is because if you go to a communist nation, if you go to a third world nation and you say, hey, the way that you're making this product is not environmentally friendly, you need to stop doing that. I think number one, they're going to look at you and have no idea what you're saying. And number two is, if they do have any idea what you're saying, they're going to say, I don't care. I'm just trying to make a living for my family. This is the only way I can do it. So that's a bigger problem than the United States being this big brother that's just destroying the entire world, like the radical left makes it seem. Number three, I would say, is birth rate. It's if, like you mentioned, if humans are polluting, which that's what we were designed to do. I mean, we were designed to eat meat, to kill animals, to pollute, to that's just part of being a human, to breathe. We were made to breathe. And so don't have children. I have children. Again, I brought up earlier, this is not a priority for me, but don't have children and encourage others not to have children. As ridiculous as that sounds, that would probably help on a worldwide level. And then number four is, I mean, this is radical, but if it's true, if you're a true environmentalist, then you should just convince everybody to kill themselves, because, and this is going to go into the next topic on the lockdowns that happened in 2020. But if everyone killed themselves and there were no people, then there would be no pollution.
No, that's not true. Pollution is a value judgment in some ways too. It is not just you're talking about toxic things. I'm not sure, but there were forest fires before there were people, and massive forest fires because there were no people to put them out to begin with, and there's always been lightning. So that would have been the main source of pollution back in the day. I do not believe that people should be forced into a certain diet. I think there's all kinds of different diets that people can have that are healthy. Let me just give you one fact. The European civilization, all of Europe, depended on wood for its energy up until about 1750, 1800. Then fossil fuels came in. So up until then, wood was the only source of fire, the only source of heat. And there would be wood smoke everywhere in all the towns. And during that time, because steel was made using wood and glass works were made using wood and all of industry used wood and every home and building was heated with wood without any pollution control, just a smokestack coming out the chimney. So there was a great deal of air pollution back then, so much less than there is today, where we burn our fuel much more cleanly. Back then, the forests of Europe were eventually reduced to less than 10% of the total land area of Europe. That includes Eastern and Western Europe. Today, 43% of Europe is covered in trees because silviculture was invented due to the fact that the trees were disappearing because they were being used faster than they were growing. So that's a great success story. Now, go onto the internet and look for satellite images of the Amazon rainforest and the Congo rainforest in Africa. You will see that they are virtually intact. There's only a very small percentage of them that has been turned into non-forested areas, and most of that is agriculture, growing food, plants. So let's look at plastic. Everybody's thinking that plastic is bad in the ocean, that there's a great Pacific garbage patch, twice the size of Texas, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. That's a lie. There is no garbage patch. You can look at a satellite image of the Pacific Ocean. You can see the Hawaiian Islands quite clearly. They are not twice the size of Texas. And there is no visible garbage patch in the Pacific Ocean. In addition, plastic floating in the sea is not much different than wood floating in the sea. There's lots of wood in the sea. It comes down the rivers in floods and goes out to sea. And that causes lots of animals and plants in the ocean live on the wood and live on the plastic. Barnacles and crabs and many species take advantage of floating material, debris in the sea. And the most crazy thing of all is that seabirds like albatross use bits of hard plastic as a digestive aid for their chicks and for themselves for their whole lives. Land birds use pebbles. They have to have pebbles in their gizzard all their life to help grind large pieces of food, because birds have no teeth. They're not able to chew their food like we are before we swallow it. And so they have two stomachs, one's like ours with acid in it to digest soft and easy material. But the other one, if you feed your chick or yourself a whole squid, like 6-inch long squid, you need to put it in the gizzard where it gets ground up. But there's no pebbles in the sea. So seabirds use pumice, which are pebbles that float up from undersea volcanoes occasionally. They use bits of driftwood that are the right size and shape, and they use nuts that have fallen from mangrove trees into the sea and have drifted out to where they are. And now, for the last 50 or 60 years, they've been using appropriately sized and shaped pieces of plastic. It's well documented. There's lots of scientific literature on it. At first, scientists thought maybe that would harm the birds. That's been proven to be untrue. Doesn't harm them, it helps them. So you've got this ridiculous myth about plastic being toxic when we wrap all our food in it to keep it from becoming contaminated. And when it goes in the sea, it doesn't suddenly turn toxic. It's perfectly harmless. Now, I know people don't like litter, but litter doesn't really damage the environment. Another one I wanted to mention just while we were talking about trees. In the old days, people gathered all the dead wood around their communities, going back to the beginning of civilization. They went out and gathered the wood in the fall so that they would have heat in the winter and cook their food. So they were removing all that fuel load, that dry wood that's easily catches fire if there's a lightning storm and causes a conflagration. Today, people are just letting the wood build up in the forest, and that's one of the main reasons why these forest fires are so intense and large, is because nobody's collecting the wood. And there's a lot of people who live in cities who have power over the forests that think it's a good idea just to leave them alone. Well, that would be fine if there weren't any towns around. But when the fire in California, they had built a suburb in the middle of a pine forest so that the houses were right up against pine trees and right up against pine forests that weren't being managed. That's why 90 people died in the Camp Fire in California, was because they had not been looking after the forest properly. And you shouldn't build a town in coniferous, pitchy trees. You should get rid of them and make some lumber out of them and plant trees that don't burn like that. The broadleaf trees are not pitchy. Oak trees and sycamores and all those, they don't catch on fire like that. If you look at a picture of Central Park, it's really almost all forested, but there's no coniferous trees, or very, very few in there. They're mostly broadleaf trees that do not go up in flames like the coniferous pines and spruce and those species of trees. So I'll end my little monologue there.
I want to go back to 2020. Well, before we go back to 2020, of course, I was being facetious with most of my recommendations, but that's what you hear a lot from the left, and it's, well, these are the solutions according to what you bring up are the problems. Instead of spending trillions and trillions of dollars on something, like I said, that doesn't really affect most of the population, or where even better, most of the population just doesn't care, at least productive members of society, these would be some of the solutions. But I want to go back to 2020. When we saw the lockdowns happen, there were pictures, images going viral of the sky, of lakes and rivers, and just how clean the air looked, how clean the waters looked, because everyone was locked in their homes. Nobody was driving. When I say nobody, I mean very few people were driving. When I say no pollution, I obviously mean less pollution. Of course, you can't get to zero pollution, but people were just locked down in their homes, and there was this, I don't want to call it propaganda, but there was a lot of media attention on, oh, this is good. People being locked down is good for the environment. Can you tell us if that was true or false? Was it real, or was it just all, some sort of fairy tale? And also, if you've seen any impact on work from home, because even though we've put the pandemic behind us, work from home has become somewhat permanent in many industries. Has that helped with the pollution, with the climate change, with the carbon emissions, which, as you said, are actually good for the environment?
Well, that's the point. They are actually good for the environment. As smoke is not good for the environment or for people's lungs. But the air is very clean in the industrialized world compared to what it was when wood was the primary fuel and coal was the primary fuel in all the buildings in London, for example, where great fogs came and people died in the winter from the air pollution from burning coal without any pollution control. today the coal-fired power plants that are built for making electricity are so much cleaner than what they were in the past. I mean, the air of the world is so much cleaner than it was. Actually, the main cause of air pollution today is forest fires, and many of those are caused by lightning. And the fact is that a very much smaller area of forest is burning annually in the United States today than did back in the 1920s and before that, when there was no management. The wealthier people are, the more resources they have to make the environment clean. And that's what's happened. There's still people in Africa who are burning wood inside their huts to cook their food and keep warm, because actually there are places in Africa where it gets cold in the winter. And we just don't have a sense of the history on these things. The human flourishing actually gives us the resources to keep the environment cleaner and to pay for the pollution control devices on our cars. And it wasn't long ago, in the 1950s, when nearly every city was choked in fog in the fall as it cooled off because of the pollution from vehicles. But there's not much bad coming out of the tailpipe of cars today. So it's mostly CO2 and water. And that's just a fact. People live longer now than they ever did in the history of the human species, going back a million years. So, well, not quite a million, but I think we say that Homo sapiens evolved about 300,000 years ago, and that we are the most recent addition of humans. That there were humans before that, the Neanderthals, for example. So, fire was actually the fundamental beginning of human civilization. It was the control of fire. And today, most of the activists in the environmental side of things, as they call themselves, are against fire. They don't want us to have gas stoves anymore. They don't want us to have gas furnaces. They don't want us to have a car that runs on fossil fuels. They're just plain, and they blame all the forest fires on people, when in fact lightning is the cause of many of them. Many of them are caused by people, and people should be more careful. But one of the main problems with the forests is they're not keeping them in a state that will not, that would have far less conflagration than if they leave all the dead wood there for 20 years. And that's just a fact. And as I mentioned, that was taken care of in the past. We were doing a better job in many ways of managing our forests in the past than we are today, especially in North America. And you don't have these kind of fires in Europe or in the southeast of the U.S., where it's all managed timber. They don't want their forests burning up, and they see their forest as valuable. Whereas in the West, most of the forests, or many of them, are federally owned. They're owned by the government, and they don't have any value because no one's using them. And it's fine. Yes, let's have national parks and places where we don't cut the wood, but maybe do clean up the forest floor and use that wood. If there's no income from a forest, there's no money to look after it. So many people have a completely, especially city people, of which is now the vast majority of people, they do not have a very knowledgeable understanding of forests and forest management. My family has been in forestry in British Columbia for over 100 years. So we got a pretty good clue about what's going on there. And people just won't listen to the idea that if you don't manage the forest, especially near urban settlements, you're going to have forest fires, and they're going to be catastrophic, and they're going to kill people. That's just a fact. You can't stop lightning in particular, and you can't stop carelessness among people starting fires by leaving a campfire with its embers still glowing. You should be managing the forest better than that.
I want to talk a little bit about nuclear energy. What is it? How is it currently being used? What are your thoughts?
There are 440 odd nuclear reactors operating every day, 24/7 in the world today. They started 50 years ago or more. In the United States and Canada, between the two have more than 100 nuclear reactors. No one has ever been harmed by one of them, never mind killed. And yet people are in all this great fear of radiation. That's why I call my book Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom. CO2 is invisible. Radiation is invisible. Whatever's supposed to be bad in genetically modified foods is invisible. In fact, it doesn't exist, or it would have a name. It doesn't have a name, so it can't possibly be real. Also, things that are very remote, where people can't see for themselves. Observation is the basis of scientific discovery. The very beginning is observation. If you can't observe it, you can't see it, you can't talk about it with any knowledge. And people can't see all the polar bears and they can't see all the coral reefs. That's why those two are the icons in climate change, because no one can verify it for themselves. If you told people the seagulls are going extinct, of course they wouldn't believe you because they see the seagulls all over the place. In the Arctic, back in 1973, on the advice of wildlife biologists who told governments of the Arctic countries that the polar bears were declining due to overhunting, there was a treaty signed among all of the Arctic nations to end the unrestricted hunting of polar bears and either ban it altogether or make a very strict regulation as to how many could be hunted. Since then, the population has grown from somewhere between 5,000 to 8,000 to somewhere between 30,000 to 50,000. And they're pretty much fat and happy. As a matter of fact, conditions in the Arctic may well be optimum for polar bears now, because if the whole Arctic was covered in ice like it was during the most recent glacial advance, then there's no way the sunlight can get to the Arctic Sea to produce plankton, which then produces fish, which then produces seals, which then feeds polar bears. So the Arctic Sea should be open for the summer, at least a big chunk of it, so that it can produce the food for the winter coming on when the bears go out on the ice to hunt. The same thing with the coral reefs. If the Earth gets warmer, the coral reefs will expand, not contract. The warmest ocean in the world is in Indonesia, where the highest biodiversity of coral is. 600 species of coral and 2,000 species of reef fish living among the coral. If the world warmed up, that would expand into the cooler places, which restrict the number of species of coral. So it's a total lie that the coral reefs are threatened by a slight bit of global warming. Not only that, it's very clear that the global warming that has occurred since 1700, long before fossil fuels became used to any extent, the temperature has been rising since then very, very slowly, a little over 1 degree Celsius, about 2 degrees Fahrenheit. But when we started burning fossil fuels in a big way, starting around 1800 and then increasing drastically through the 1900s, and today burning more than we ever have, that has not resulted in an increased rate of temperature rise. It's just coming up in a very, very slow straight line from 1700. So there's no way that there's any evidence that CO2 is the cause of that slight rise. It is a perfectly natural rise of temperature, and the going into the Little Ice Age was a perfectly natural decline of the temperature. Temperature's been going up and down forever, and right now it's not going up very fast, and there's no threat to life on Earth from it. A 1.5 degree increase, as the fakers say, is going to cause the Earth to die, almost, and people to die. That's smaller than the difference between the average temperature in Washington, D.C. and New York City. I mean, if you look at the difference in temperature between the equator and the North Pole, it's a huge difference. And where are most of the species? At the equator. And the further north you come, especially when you come where there's frost, ice is the enemy of life, not its friend. And it's just a very sort of interesting thing that bears figured out how to go out on ice when the ice came and hunt seals. But that's an exception in life. There's not too many species that depend on ice for their survival.
That's Dr. Patrick Moore, co-founder and former president of Greenpeace Canada. Check out his #1 best-selling books, Confessions of a Greenpeace Dropout, The Making of a Sensible Environmentalist, as well as a new book, Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom. The website is ecosense.me or ecosense.me. That's ECOSENSE.me, ecosense.me. And then, of course, what he founded, Greenpeace Canada, that website, in case you were interested, greenpeace.org. That's PEACE, greenpeace.org. Dr. Patrick Moore, any final thoughts you want to share with our listeners or anything else you want to promote?
Well, just that I hope people will look at the bright side of things rather than thinking it's doom and gloom. We are so lucky in the industrialized countries to have the life we have. And in many ways, it would be better for the world if the people in the developing countries could have a similar life as we do. And then the air would be cleaner. Instead of using dung and wood as their fuel inside their huts and letting the smoke out into the atmosphere, they too could afford to use cleaner fuels. The fossil fuels you see are all made from life. And that means that every molecule of CO2 we are putting into the atmosphere is simply being returned to where it came from in the first place. Every atom of carbon in the fossil fuels came from the atmosphere or from the ocean in order to make life. And then that life turned into fossil fuels. The forests created the coal, and the seas created the oil and gas. All of that is natural. It is not a deadly poison. I mean, you're not supposed to drink gasoline, that's for sure. But it's been turned into those substances through time inside the earth. And don't feel guilty about using it. Use it sparingly. I'm not saying we should buy gas guzzling vehicles, but on the other hand, if you're towing a boat or a trailer, you need a more powerful motor than if you're just driving a little sedan around. I have a smart car for two. I use it every time I go in the town. I don't use my larger truck, which tows my boat and takes me to Winter Harbor over 45 miles of gravel road up at the north end of the island. You need a decent vehicle to get across there. The smart car is not the right choice, but it is the right choice for in the city if you're just putting around, going by and shopping for clothes or food. And that's what I have to say. I say, do not fret for the fate of the earth. Be frugal. Don't waste things. But on the other hand, enjoy your life. I mean, that's why we're here. So I don't think people should feel guilty. I think people should look around them and see what they can do to make the earth better and make other people's lives better. And that's what I've set myself out to do my whole life.
Patrick Moore, thank you so much for joining us on the Work From Home Show. To all our listeners, check us out at workfromhomeshow.com. That's www.workfromhomeshow.com. Get on our mailing list there. Follow us on social media. If you have any questions or thoughts you want to share with us, or you just want to get in touch, hello@workfromhomeshow.com. That's our email address, hello@workfromhomeshow.com. And until next week, keep on working from home.